All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to give people a couple more minutes to get in, and we will start promptly at 11 a.m. Good morning, and welcome to the Chemical Facilities Anti-Terrorism Standard, CFATS webinar, presented by the APPA Standards and Codes Council. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the APPA website. You will receive an email with the link when everything has been uploaded. Questions should be typed in the chat box and will be answered in the order they are received. If we run out of time, all remaining questions will be answered by Maureen by email. These monthly webinars are now giving continuing education credits for attendance. If you have a group attending this webinar, please contact me and I will send you a form to complete and return so everyone will receive credits. The form will also be available on the webinar archive page on the APPA website. The Standards and Codes Council reports directly to the APPA board and is charged with keeping APPA members informed about the hundreds of standards and codes that affect facility officers every day. More recently, the Standards and Code Council has represented APPA members on the development of facilities management standards through the International Standards Organization, ISO. In addition, APPA is an ANSI recognized standard developer and has its first draft standard, APPA 1000 Total Cost of Ownership, TCO, for facilities in the final stages of approval. The TCO work group anticipates publishing the ANSI approved standard in late December or early 2018. These are the members of the Standards and Codes Council. As noted on this slide, the Council has a mission to provide the latest information on standards and codes to its membership. The Council presently monitors relevant standards and codes activities from more than 20 national and global standards development organizations and government agencies. Among the organizations that are followed most closely are NFPA, ASHRAE, ASME, ICODES. APPA collaborates with organizations identified above. Today's presenter is Maureen Cottless. Maureen is an Executive Director of the Department of Environmental Safety, Sustainability, and Risk at the University of Maryland, College Park. Her experience in higher education also includes the University of Maryland, Baltimore, University of Missouri, Harvard University, and Stony Brook University. Maureen served as the president of the Campus Safety, Health, and Environmental Management Association, SHEMA, from 2010 to 2011. It is my pleasure to turn this presentation over to Maureen.
Thank you, Billy, and good morning to all the attendees. I'd first like to thank APPA and SHIMA for giving me the opportunity to speak to all of you today on the Chemical Facility Anti-Terrorism Standards, also known as CFAS, on how those regulations apply and affect higher education facilities. There's a survey that was done that many of you may have participated in recently by APPA on your experience with these regulations, and based on that, it seems like there's a variety of attendees on the call who either have had experience or may still be having experience with the Department of Homeland Security on these regulations, others who identified that they may not have been affected by the regulation or were not aware of the regulation, and perhaps some that still are not aware of the regulation. So my hope is that the presentation today is going to cover a little of everything for everybody that may have questions or want to get updated on this regulation. So I'm going to start a little bit with some of the basics. I'll talk about what the status of these regulations are now in 2017, and then what happens if you report any chemicals that are required to be reported by the regulation, what to expect from that process. So as for basics, the department, could you go back one? Thank you. The beginning of these regulations, the inception of these regulations came through the Homeland Security Appropriations Act of 2007. This act established authority for the Department of Homeland Security to regulate the security of high-risk chemical facilities. And I'll be talking about what that means, high-risk chemical facilities, shortly. It applies to 322 chemicals of interest, known as COI, and I'm going to be using that acronym COI throughout the presentation. We'll talk about how concentrations of these chemicals and quantities affect the regulation. There are also some standards, risk-based performance standards, that I will mention a little bit later on. And the intent of these is that Homeland Security wants to make sure that high-risk chemical facilities have adequate security measures in place to reduce the risk of terrorist acts and consequences. And I want to reinforce that this is not what you may be familiar with safety regulations. This is very security-driven and very specific to terrorists or other types of acts that may be committed to harm people. There are some exemptions in these regulations, but I'm not going to go through detail other than to let you know that some of these exemptions would really not apply at colleges and universities. One that does pop up occasionally is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission mentioned in the regulations, and this really would only exempt an entire institution if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations, for example, for radioisotopes, if it required the entire facility to have security standards around it, and that's not usually the case. If you need more information on that topic, I can certainly help you get some direction on that if that's something that anybody on the call has interest in knowing about. So I'd like to next talk a little bit about the definition of chemical facility, because this is really an important part of these regulations. And the chemical facility definition, according to Homeland Security, means an establishment that possesses or plans to possess a quantity of a chemical that has been determined by this agency to be potentially dangerous. And those are, again, the chemicals of interest, or COI. Next slide, please. So, do the regulations apply to colleges and universities? Well, my short answer here is yes, they do. The high-risk chemical facilities are determined by the Department of Homeland Security, not by the institution. Now, these regulations are largely an honor system, but the Department of Homeland Security does have the authority to identify facilities it considers high risk. So what that means is that if an institution has not engaged with Homeland Security to report a regulated chemical or chemicals, but Homeland Security feels that that institution, that facility, has some risk related to it, they can reach out and require that institution to report chemicals. And later on, I'll talk about the violations and what the violation might be if you don't report what you have. The security standards that are in this regulation are not a good fit for colleges and universities. I'll put that out there right up front, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those examples later on. And Despite that, higher education associations have sort of partnered back in 2007 and even more recently to try to get some changes made to these regulations to make them a little bit more reasonable for our colleges and universities. These have included getting Homeland Security to allow more flexibility in defining the boundaries of the facility. So many of you are at colleges and universities with maybe hundreds of buildings on campus. Not all of those buildings might have chemicals in them, but some might. And this definition now allows a campus to decide, do you want to treat your facility as a building by building issue rather than the entire campus being one facility? And I think you'll see the reasoning why that would be important to think about a little later on in this presentation. There's also an exclusion now for laboratory quantities of some of the chemicals on the list, and I'll discuss what those are shortly. And I think one of the big wins for us was that we were able to get acetone taken from off the list as a regulated chemical. There's acetone virtually everywhere on college campuses and laboratories and perhaps elsewhere, and this became very problematic from the perspective of perhaps ending up having colleges and universities widely being regulated under this regulation. So I want to switch gears here a bit and talk about Homeland Security's perception of high risk, to put this into a context for the rest of the presentation. And I will note that on some of my slides, you'll see these pictures of information or manuals. These aren't meant for you to be able to read in this presentation, but I wanted to call your attention to the fact that Homeland Security does provide information on their website on different topics that they're working on or changes in regulations, and some of the documents that you would need to have, manuals and so forth, if you are regulated by this regulation, also are on their website. So you'll see some photos of those later on as well. And I do also, this just a little warning that I learned when I was preparing for this presentation, is if you are looking for chemical facility anti-terrorism standard information or any of the documents that I mentioned, I would advise you not to Google them, but to go directly to the Department of Homeland Security website. And the reason for that is there are some older versions of some of these documents still floating out there on the internet that you may pick up in a Google search. You're going to get the most recent documents if you go directly to Homeland Security's website. So let's talk about high risk and what these different criteria are: vulnerability, consequence, and threat. So first, let me talk about vulnerability. Thank you. So these are the three characteristics, and now you're seeing the vulnerability perspective. So this talks about the characteristics of the facility, and I think one of the most important aspects of this is to think about whether your institution, your facility, is in an urban or rural setting. Homeland Security is more than likely going to be more concerned about high risk if you are in a high population area or urban area as opposed to being in a rural area. Doesn't mean you wouldn't be regulated if you're in a rural area, but one of their biggest concerns is the consequence to large populations. And so that is something to be giving thought to. You can see some of the other criteria that they use in assessing whether a facility is considered high risk. A lot of the methodology of what they use is sensitive or classified. So it's really hard to understand what they're really looking for unless you engage directly with them as a regulated facility. So I'm going to give you as much as I can without actually giving the details of how they would assess a specific facility that's regulated. So next slide, please. The second of these types of criteria is consequence, and this is where Homeland Security assesses what could happen if there was harm done by a terrorist related to these chemicals of interest. There is a way that Homeland Security uses dispersion and blast modeling to determine this. So, for example, if you have 10,000-pound propane tanks on your campus and someone goes around and blows up 3 of them, where is that propane cloud going to head? They have ways to do that. It's not publicly available information, but that is one of the ways they determine consequence. And you can see some of the other criteria that they use specific to the type of chemical that's used. So the specific chemical becomes important in that assessment as well. And then finally, next slide, the threat. And this is where there's the least information available from Homeland Security. They consider a lot of it, as I said, sensitive and classified. However, you may have access to threat information from your local intelligence and emergency response agencies. Your police department, as an example, may be getting intelligence briefings or information on local threats. If you're in a joint terrorism task force, you may get information that way as well. And then there are other threat concerns related to the chemical, whether you're shipping the chemical, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, and what your adversary is capable of doing. So let's get to the chemicals of interest. These chemicals are listed in what is called Appendix A. You see a screenshot of that document here. This is actually the second part of the regulation. When the regulation was first promulgated in 2007, there was an initial interim final rule, and then this was part 2, which was the actual list of chemicals with other details related to their reasoning for having these chemicals. And within this list, if you look at the table, you're going to see 3 different criteria that they use for assessing risk. And if you just hit that next part of the slide, thank you. There are 3 risk categories to these chemicals, and I just want to mention that some chemicals will fall into more than one category. So we have release, theft, diversion, and sabotage contamination. I'm going to show those on the next several slides, what those refer to. So chemicals of interest in the release category are either toxic, flammable, or explosive, and if they were released to the public, you would have one of those types of hazards. And you can see some examples of chemicals here that I list. Some of them may be found at universities and colleges. They aren't necessarily at colleges and universities, but they may be there. The second category are theft or diversion chemicals. These are chemicals that could be stolen or diverted. So as a result, Homeland Security is only concerned if those chemicals are in Department of Transportation compliant transportation packaging. And the reason for that is that you could pick up the package in theory, walk away with it, put it in a truck, drive away, and now you've been able to either divert or steal the chemical. And these are categories of those types of chemicals: chemical weapons, weapons of mass effect, explosives, and their precursors. I can tell you that some of these chemicals might be on your college campuses if there is Department of Defense work. So even though they sound scary and you think they might not be there, they might be. And then the last category is sabotage, contamination. These are chemicals that if they're mixed with other readily available materials, there'd be significant adverse consequences. And this photo here, you see a water source. That would probably be the most obvious readily available material, would be a river, a lake, a pool, some other body of water on or near a university campus, where a chemical could be put into that water source and cause a poisonous gas, as an example. So we next go to the quantities that are involved here. And so if you just skip ahead here to the screening threshold quantity slide. Sorry about that. One more. Thank you. So screening threshold quantity is a key part of this. So let's say you look at the list of chemicals, you see that you have some of them or think you could have some of them on your college campus. This all depends on how much you have, and it depends on the category. And you can see there's a wide variety of amounts that may be involved with these categories. I want to call your attention to the CUM 100G that's listed there in the theft diversion category. So these are 100 grams, first of all, is about 1/4 pound, small amount. In the theft category, if you have it in transportation packaging, then in some cases you have to count every chemical that is on your campus that has that theft or diversion aspect to it in the total. That's what cumulative means. In the sabotage aspect, it's if you have to placard it and at how much you have to placard it. And I'll tell you right now, the Department of Transportation requirements for placarding would either be any amount or 1,001 pounds. So if you have any amount chemicals that are in this category, you would probably be required to report that to Homeland Security. And then lastly is an important part, if you have mixtures, I took back one more slide, there's one more item on there at the bottom. If you have a mixture, then there is criteria for minimum concentrations. How much in the mixture is there for you to have to report it? Okay, next slide, please. So here's some examples of what might be seen in colleges, chemicals of interest in higher education. Nitric acid is an example. It's found in many laboratories. It wouldn't be impossible to think you'd have 400 pounds if you looked at the entire campus. You might not have 400 pounds if you were doing a facility as a building, but that also depends on the size of the building. So it's possible that there could be that much. If you have chemical storerooms, maybe there is that much. And then you can see the other categories here. Dichlorosilane might be found in clean rooms. If you're using ammonia as a refrigerant, for example, for ice rinks, a 20,000 pound amount. Ammonium nitrate used as a fertilizer on farms and ranches, 2,000 pounds. And if you have propane tanks that are equal to or greater than 10,000 pounds, and you have a total of 60,000 pounds, fire training academies, perhaps farms, it's not impossible to think you might have this kind of quantity. There is an exclusion that I mentioned earlier on to laboratories, and I just want to identify this. If you have laboratories, probably all of you do on your campus, these categories of release chemicals do not have to be reported as long as they are being used in a laboratory. If they're out on the campus in facilities areas or elsewhere, art studios, other types of locations, they would still have to be reported. This exclusion is for laboratories only. And any other type of chemicals in other categories would still have to be reported in laboratories. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide, please. So I just want to take you to where we are right now with CFAS before I go into a little bit deeper into some of these regulations. So in 2014, this was the most recent reauthorization of this regulation, and it was called the Protecting and Securing Chemical Facilities from Terrorist Acts of 2014. It's also known as CFAS Act of 2014. It was reauthorized for 4 years, so we're still in that time period of reauthorization. There were some changes for those of you that may have been involved with this in the past. There's a new risk tiering methodology that's used. It's a little mysterious, I will say. As I mentioned, Homeland Security doesn't share a lot of detail. There used to be a requirement to go in and kind of identify your adversary and how they might attack you and what the probabilities are. That appears to not be in there anymore. I'm not saying they won't require that if you are regulated, but in the initial parts of the submissions you might have to do, it's not there. There are some efforts to try to expedite the program for the higher risk chemical facilities. Here I'll insert a little comment that the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee in 2014 issued a report that criticized Homeland Security for a broken program, including the finding that Homeland Security does not know if some dangerous chemical facilities exist. And so one of the things that they are looking for are facilities that have not reported but should have reported. So just a mention of that. Homeland Security has been contacting some institutions to resubmit information they submitted back in 2007. If you're one of those, you already know what they're asking you to do. If you never submitted anything in the past, they wouldn't be recontacting you, but that doesn't mean you're off the hook. And I want to emphasize this last bullet. It's really important. The regulation requires all facilities to submit information to the Department of Homeland Security, and I'll be telling you how that's done in a minute, within 60 days of possession of a chemical of interest at or above the screening threshold quantity. So if you know that you have a chemical, if you're planning to get a chemical, or if you're shipping a chemical that this might apply to, you have to let them know within 60 days. That's the regulation. Next slide, please. So how do you check for the possession of chemicals of interest, or should you? And that's a big question. If you have not done this in the past, you weren't aware of the regulation, you weren't, it didn't apply in the past, or you did go through the process and found that you were not being looked at as a high-risk facility from Homeland Security, where do you go now? And so I really can't tell you what to do, but I can tell you sort of the thought process maybe to use. So the first thing to do is when you check for chemicals of interest, if you are going to go through a process of seeing whether this regulation applies now, even if it didn't in the past, or maybe you never knew if it applied, is to use existing procurement and or inventory systems, if you have them, to go through and see what's being purchased or what is in different locations through barcoding or other inventory systems. Another tactic that a lot of universities used back in 2007, including the one that I worked for at the time, was to develop an in-house screening tool or hire a consultant to do so, and send out a list to your chemical or to your campus stakeholders and ask them, do you have any of these chemicals in these quantities? You can also communicate through site visits, direct communication, but make sure that you're checking with everyone. Facilities units, laboratories, fire training academies, farms, clean rooms, ice rinks, golf courses, medical facilities if you have them, central shipping and receiving. It's a very broad regulation if you have the chemicals. It could apply to many different locations if you have these chemicals in these quantities. It's not just a laboratory-driven requirement or not just a facilities-driven requirement. You're going to want to check for shipping of any chemicals of interest is another area. It doesn't typically, as I mentioned, apply to hazardous waste shipping, but it may apply to chemicals that you are shipping to other institutions, collaborators. If you're in a university system and you share inventory back and forth, or for certain types of hazardous waste, you may have an issue if you are shipping those. One question that comes up is, what if we have it and we have chemicals of interest and we don't want them, we don't want to be regulated? And Homeland Security has stated to the higher education sector in the past that reducing the quantities of chemicals of interest to below the screening threshold quantity or eliminating it entirely is a legitimate security strategy. They don't look at that as gaming the system. They look at it as, if you get rid of it or you reduce the quantity to a level below the one that we're concerned with, that's actually legitimate. It keeps us safer. It keeps your facility safer. So that can be done, but just a word of warning, if you have it and you decide to discard it, you've had knowledge of possession without reporting it to Homeland Security, you could be in violation of the regulation. So something to give some thought to if that's an issue for you. So if you possess a chemical of interest, what do? You go out and you do your inventory and you find you've got something. What do you have to do here? Well, the first thing is you're going to want to go on the Homeland Security website and you're going to go to the Chemical Security Assessment Tool. It's an online tool. You'll have to register and you'll have to identify 3 out of these 4 aspects that are in the next bullet: submitter, preparer, and authorizer. This reviewer is optional. The submitter, the preparer, and authorizer are not. The preparer is the person that the university or college authorizes to enter data into their system. So this is the person that has it all in knowledge. They've gained knowledge of where chemicals are and whether there's anything that applies. And if you have to report something, they're authorized to do that. The authorizer is the person that says that person can do that. And often they want to see somebody at a fairly high level, perhaps even at a vice presidential level or beyond. And then the submitter is, as you might imagine, the person that pushes the button. They're the final person that hits the send button to send it to Homeland Security. One person can do all 3 of those. You can have an authorizer and submitter and preparer. They all have to reside in the United States, one of the requirements. The reviewer, which is a separate person that kind of does another look at it for the institution. That's the person that say, look, we want to just make sure, we want somebody else to see this before we send it. That reviewer, maybe curiously in my mind, has to be a U.S. citizen. That's in the regulations. Now you can have other authorized users in your entity if it makes sense to do that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how information has to be protected in a few minutes, and there's training involved in that. So anybody else that you're going to bring into this process that's going to have deep knowledge of what you're collecting information on would have to be authorized users. The next thing you're going to do is fill out information on something called a top screen. It's an online questionnaire. It asks facility information, and then it asks for what you have, what chemicals of interest, and in what quantity you have them. Next slide, please. After you report, you're going to get contacted by Homeland Security. I can't give you a time frame. I don't know how long that takes now, but they're going to tell you whether you are in a high-risk tier. There are 4 risk tiers, 1 through 4. The highest risk is tier 1. The lowest risk is tier 4. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4. If you are in these risk tiers, you're going to have to submit a security vulnerability assessment and a site security plan within 120 days. So if you are in the process of looking at chemicals and you know you've got something, it's time before you even hit the send button to start looking at all of your, and I'll go through these, what these documents are, what you already have in place on at your institution related to security and security planning. In the earlier version of the Security Vulnerability Assessment Site Security Plan in 2007, and shortly after, these were two separate documents, and it was a two-step process. It's now one step. It's all done in one submission. You're going to have to comply with risk-based security standards, and I'll talk about those in a few minutes. And then there is an option of submitting something called an alternate security plan. All of the tiered facilities have that option now. It used to only be available to the lowest risk, Tier 4. It's now available, or Tier 3 and 4, I believe. Now all facilities can do that. It's another way of submitting something you already have in existence. So if you already have a lot of evolved security plan documents, you don't have to recreate the wheel here, and you can submit what you have that may satisfy Homeland Security's requirements. Next slide, please. So let me go back to the security vulnerability assessment. I'm sorry, skipped over that one by mistake. So the security vulnerability assessment part of it, recall what I talked about earlier on was the way that Homeland Security assesses risk. And now we're looking at what they want you to tell them about risk, what your risk is at your institution. As I said, it's combined with the site security plan. You fill out the SVA, and then you fill out the site security plan. In the SVA part, they're going to want to know what chemicals of interest, again, because you've already submitted that top screen. Now you're doing it again. And how you're using it. Do you ship it? How you receive it? A little bit of detail about your chemicals of interest, or one or more if you have more than one. And your critical assets. What is it that supports the storage, the handling, the shipping, the security, the safety of that chemical of interest? They're going to want to know about the facility. They want to know about your any kind of security planning you have, any equipment, security management systems, all of that. And then they're going to ask for a vulnerability assessment that you have to describe in detail. This means writing it out, detection, delay, response measures, and I'll cover this in a second, a little bit more detail, your cybersecurity measures as they relate to the chemicals of interest, and your vulnerability. Next slide, please. In the site security plan part, you're going to address how you detect, delay, and respond. These are basic security strategies that you'll see anytime you look at security. You're going to see detection, delay, and response. These are examples in the bullets of what you might have in place. You're not required to have all of these, but these are, if you do have them, you'd want to be addressing what you have in place related to detection, delay, and response. So it includes your security forces, your systems, your lighting, your inventory controls, any kind of access controls, key credential controls, crisis planning, joint exercises, and so forth. The protection of your cyber systems and security management, how you inspect, test, and monitor your security systems, how you handle training of your personnel, personnel surety, which basically means how do you identify people are okay to access chemicals of interest, do you do background checks, those kinds of things, and how you respond to and make notification of security incidents. Now, this is a little confusing, this part, so I'm going to kind of take this slow. As these risk-based performance standards, and again, this is available on the Homeland Security website. There are 18 of them. You must address them if you are regulated and you're having to go this far into the regulation, if you're having to provide site security plans and so forth. You have to address these standards. Homeland Security considers them to be non-prescriptive, and that the information is considered guidance. If you can read that, that picture, it does say guidance. However, you have to be able to address all 18 in some way. What Homeland Security cannot do is they can't disapprove a site security plan because you aren't using a specific type of security measure. For example, if you don't use CCTV, closed circuit TV, at your facility, your regulated facility, they can't deny your site security plan because of that, as long as you have an acceptable way to manage that security aspect. And if you just hit the next button, Billy, for me, there's a couple more on this slide. So I'm not going to go through 18 standards. That would take too much time, but I do want to note a few that are in there that are particularly, I think, in my opinion, problematic to colleges and universities. And these include restricting area perimeter. This means something like physically limiting access or monitoring the perimeter. Now think about this if your facility is the entire campus. How many of you have a facility that you can say you are monitoring the entire perimeter and limiting access? Probably not many, if any at all. Now that may be a little easier to answer if you are defining a facility by a building. So let's say you have the 400 pounds of nitric acid in one laboratory building. You might, if you had to, be able to do some perimeter access controls and so forth, but still would not be an easy thing to do, particularly if you have classrooms and students coming in and out. Another one is securing site assets. This again goes to who's getting into these areas where you have chemicals of interest, and if they're in a laboratory, as an example, how do you limit that access? How do you keep surveillance of those assets? Screening and controlling, knowing who is allowed on site before they can even get to the locations where you may have a chemical of interest. And then things like background checks, escorted access. If you read through these standards, these things are probably pretty problematic for most if you had to put those controls into place. Next slide, please. Now, I want to go back a little bit into when I mentioned authorized users and the protection of information. Homeland Security in these regulations has something called Chemical Terrorism Vulnerability Information, or CVI. That green and white sheet of paper you see a photo of is the cover sheet that they require you to use if you have any written information related to your chemicals of interest. Again, if you're regulated. If you're not regulated, none of these things apply. But if you are regulated, you have to use these types of methods to protect information. It restricts information to authorized users, and recall that I said earlier on that you can have other people at your institution other than the submitter, the preparer, and the authorizer. You can have other people involved in this, but they have to go through this chemical terrorism vulnerability information. They have to understand where they need to protect information and how to protect information. So things like the security vulnerability assessment, the site security plan, any inspections or audits that you do or Homeland Security does, any information that you developed for the top screen, and there's more, I didn't list it all here, all is considered information that has to be protected as chemical terrorism vulnerability information. And as I mentioned, training is required. This is one thing we've brought up to Homeland Security in the past, is that, you know, it's very hard in this type of scenario where we might want to, as colleges and universities, kind of compare and benchmark and share ideas to help each other through this if we have to be regulated, when we can't tell anybody else what we've got or where it is or any of the information. And, you know, they've sort of said, Homeland Security has sort of said, well, if somebody has a need to know, and they have had the chemical vulnerability information training, then in theory you can share that information. And by the way, this would include if you have contractors, if you hire contractors to do this work for you, which you can do, but they also need to have all of this information protected and have the training and so forth. It's really not an easy answer about whether it's okay to share information. But I just want to make you aware that there is violations if you don't protect the information. So I'd be very cautious about who you provide information to unless they're an authorized user and they have a need to know. Next slide, please. So let's go into the violations. If you fail to report chemicals to Homeland Security that are regulated, so once again, chemicals of interest at the screening threshold quantity, if you have one or more of them and you fail to report, it's a violation. If you submit information that's false, it's a violation. If you fail to implement a site security plan, so if you have submitted information through the top screen, you've been contacted by the Department of Homeland Security, and they say, hey, you guys are regulated, you're going to need to do a security vulnerability assessment and site security plan. If you get to that stage, and you submit a site security plan and everything's fine, you've met their 120-day criteria, and you fail to implement it, that's a violation. By the way, if you do submit a site security plan and a security vulnerability assessment, it will have to be approved by the Department of Homeland Security. They will come and do an inspection to see if you are actually meeting the criteria that you set in those documents. And if you didn't implement it fully, then it's a violation. If they find deficiencies in those plans, that's a violation. If you violate the chemical terrorism vulnerability information, it's a violation. And if you fail to maintain any records that you're required to by the regulation, that's a violation. Next slide. Excuse me. So here's the penalties. There are 3 categories: minor, moderate, and major. You can see on the slide here the civil penalty amount per day. There's a maximum civil penalty of $33,333 per day for each day the facility is in violation. There's also a formula-driven penalty if you do not file your top screen within the 60-day requirement. Now, how would they know this? If they came to your institution and did some type of spot check, we want to check, we just think that you're high risk and we want to come and see why you have never filed a top screen. And they find that you have a chemical of interest and you failed, they find that you had possession of it longer than 60 days, you're in violation. Also, if you remember, I mentioned shipping. There are some complicated aspects that I don't have time to go into on shipping, but if you are shipping chemicals or if you have one of the hazardous wastes that is covered by this regulation and you ship it and it shows up on a manifest, then you could be, and you did not report that you had that chemical and you shipped it, that could be a violation. So, and then in red, I put probably the worst of the worst aspects that could happen here is continued non-compliance can result in order to cease operations. I'm not aware of any facilities, certainly not colleges and universities, that have had these kinds of penalties or that have had their an order to cease operations. I'm not aware of any, but not sure of that. Next slide. So I took the next 2 slides right off of Homeland Security's information. This is their information. It's a little old, but it's the most recent that I could find that they had out there. And this just gives you a sense of what's happened in the past. As of 2012, there were 324 facilities. And remember, some of these facilities may have been a building at an institution, not the entire campus. At 181 colleges and universities had submitted a top screen. So 181 out of, let's say, 4,000 or so colleges and universities had submitted a top screen as of 2012. And of these, there were some that were put in high-risk tiers, not many, but some. So it can apply. You can see the breakdown here in that pie chart that the Tier 4, which is the lowest risk, had by far the most findings were at a Tier 4 or the lowest risk level. But there were a few at Tier 2. Next slide. I also want to just point out that this is, again, Homeland Security's information on what they've done as outreach. And to their credit, they do try to do a lot of outreach. They are usually willing to come and talk to organizations and groups. They do provide various materials. They have a knowledge center on their website. They have some materials that I've already described to you that are available to colleges and universities and others. They do webinars occasionally. They do listening sessions when they're changing regulations. So there has been outreach, and I think the message here is that they're wondering why they haven't heard from more colleges and universities. They think since they've heard from some that there's probably more out there that have some of the same chemicals that were never reported. Next slide. And I put this in just to try to spur the idea that there are things we can do to influence regulations. In the rulemaking process, a lot of the associations, I list a few here, have partnered in the past to submit draft language to try to get changes made to the regulations. In the last round of rulemaking on this regulation, which as I mentioned was just a few years ago, there were public meetings and conference calls, listening sessions that you can listen in on or actually comment if you feel that it would be important for your institution or your association to be involved in that. I mentioned that they provide webinars, speakers, and that last bullet. worries me, because I still think that they are thinking there's colleges and universities out there that never reported that should have. And I don't know what might spur them to want to go looking. Maybe never. They might not do that. But I think they wonder why they haven't heard from more. And then this last slide is just some of the links to the Department of Homeland Security website. Once again, when you're looking for anything, please go directly to their website. Don't Google it, because there is some older information out there. Particularly, some of the documents have some new aspects to it that are in the new version. But these are some of the links that you can follow to get to information you need. And with that, I guess, Billy, if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yes, we do have some questions.
Okay.
Are theft diversion thresholds by building or by campus?
You have to actually decide that for yourself. So let me go back to the definition of facility and the fact that the Department of Homeland Security is allowing flexibility. So one of the strategies when you're determining whether you have chemicals of interest is to decide whether it's better for your institution to look at everything university or campus-wide and report the entire amount in every building if it exists in more than one building, or if it's better to just focus on the building and only the theft diversion chemicals in that one building. What is going to happen is if you, let's go back to if you've got something like nitric acid and you're going to have to report nitric acid, you probably have it in more than one building. So if you report campus-wide, you have a better likelihood you're going to have a lot more of it because you're looking at other buildings. If you focus only on the one building where you know you have a screening threshold quantity, the rest of the campus is off the hook for the most part. And when I say that, I'm going to say one more comment on that. But if you focus just by your building, then you're only reporting for that building. The problem with that strategy, though, is that we've heard that when you report a chemical in one building, if you're considered to be high risk, Homeland Security may require you to put security around that same chemical in other locations on the campus. This is where it gets into the direct communication between Homeland Security and the regulated facility that we don't really know what happens in those cases because nobody can talk about it. So I'll go back to the original question. Theft diversion chemicals, it's up to the institution whether they want to only focus on one building and report what they have in the one building, or if they want to report it to the entire campus. I'm not sure why you would want to report it campus-wide. In my opinion, you'd be better off only focusing on what you have to report if you have that quantity in one building. Now, if you have 5 buildings and they all meet the screening threshold quantity, then you have to make a decision whether putting security measures in place around the entire campus is more prudent and easier for you than having to put security at each one of those 5 buildings. So it's a strategy you have to think about.
Our next question is, do you have experience with waste shipments which contain COI and the need to report those as in transportation?
Yeah, so I don't, as far as I don't have experience with it happening at my campus, but I can tell you that it's something that the P and for those of you that are familiar with hazardous waste, the P and U listed hazardous waste are not excluded from this regulation. So, and if you look at the P and U listed waste, and you look at which ones from a Department of Transportation perspective would have to be placarded at any amount, there are 3 of them. And so that could trigger the requirement to report those quantities. It's really a matter of talking with your hazardous waste folks and letting them make sure they're aware of which wastes are potentially covered by the regulation, and just keep an eye out on what you ship. Look at your manifests and your history and see what you're shipping. It could trigger the regulation. The Appendix A that I mentioned lists all the chemicals. It lists the theft and diversion and the placarded amounts, and that's the beginning for you to look at to see if any of those are hazardous waste that you ship.
Okay, our next question is, do you file a CSAT if you find any COI or just if you go over the STQ?
You are only required to report if you have if you meet or exceed a screening threshold quantity. There's been no requirement that Homeland Security has told us that you have to file to say that you don't have any chemicals of interest at the screening threshold quantity. However, if you have top screens on record from back to 2007 or sometime after 2007, and Homeland Security has contacted you and said, we need you to update those top screens, there is a way that you can say either we still have it or we no longer have it. But you're not required to report any of these chemicals unless you meet the screening threshold quantity.
Okay. Should other government agencies that require inventory information for industrial user discharge permits, pre-incident planning, or EPCRA be providing CVI information to us?
Can you read that question one more time, please?
Should other government agencies that require inventory information for industrial user discharge permits, pre-incident planning, or EPCRA be providing CVI information to us?
I'm trying to kind of understand the intent of that. So if you have a question about whether an agency or entity you interact with is gaining knowledge of chemicals of interest on your campus, and it's part of a need to interact with them from a regulatory perspective, I would certainly ask them, whoever you're dealing with, whether they have been through CVI training, and then they would be an authorized user, and then it would be on a need-to-know basis, if that's what the question's intending. There are situations where there are other entities that may gain knowledge of your chemicals of interest. You have to treat them as authorized users. And the same would go the other direction. I think if you became knowledgeable about some other entity that has chemicals of interest that are regulated, once again, this is if you're regulated, then you might need to become an authorized user to be able to interact with them. It really gets into how much detail. It's okay for you to know that I have nitric acid on my campus. I will tell you right now, I have nitric acid on my campus. I can't tell you if I have screening threshold quantities of nitric acid, where they're located, and how we put security around them. That's what I can't tell you. So it's not a matter of whether you have it or not, it's whether you have it in that quantity and then the details related to security measures.
Okay, next question. How often is the COI list updated?
There hasn't really been much of an update on that since 2007, although there were changes in 2009 with a couple of things that were redone in a different way based on comments. Again, the importance of public comments, where quantities and concentrations were clarified, that kind of thing. I haven't seen any evidence that they're changing anything at all with that. There was a regulation that was pending, and I think it's still pending, on ammonium nitrate fertilizer, trying to have a more specific requirement around security of that for obvious reasons. We know there's been some very high-profile explosions and things from ammonium nitrate fertilizer type of thing. So, but I'm not aware of any other changes to the chemical of interest. I think it's still been pretty much the same for all these years.
Okay. Next question. Does a building stockroom fall under the laboratory exemption?
Good question. So the answer is it may. If the chemical stockroom is directly supporting laboratories and only laboratories where their chemicals of interest are found, then the answer would be yes. You'd have to factor in the chemical, the stockroom. If you have a central stockroom, a central warehouse that has all kinds of things in it, not just the chemicals of interest, but other things, they still be regulated, but they wouldn't be able to take they would not be able to take advantage of the laboratory exclusion. So chemical stockrooms would apply, but they may be excluded under the laboratory exclusion if they are directly related to a laboratory use. And that, again, the laboratory exclusion only applies to the release category.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question, could you speak to the APA designation on the COI list again? Does it mean any amount at all? For example, 2.0 grams.
Okay, so the APA comes from the Department of Transportation Hazardous Materials Regulations. And in that, there are tables that list what amount you have to placard various materials at. And so the table is generally either at any amount, even if you have 1 gram, you'd have to placard in some cases, or it's 1,001 pounds. So when you look at the Appendix A list, for some chemicals, it's going to list for sabotage contamination, APA. You would have to go to the DOT regulations to see whether it's any amount or the 1,001 pounds.
Thank you. Next question. So in 2007, we determined we had COIs, but below the threshold. I think we just had to document that internally. With the 2014 regulation, are we supposed to do a top screen even though we are still below the thresholds?
You're not required to submit a top screen if you don't have chemicals of interest that meet the screening threshold quantities. The question, I think, is also related to how much do you feel confident that your inventory hasn't changed since 2007? If you have a high level of confidence because you've got ways of checking, you've been communicating with your laboratories and other facilities, and you feel like you have a stable inventory, there's not, you're not now exceeding STQs that you didn't before, or you don't have, it's unlikely that you have anything new coming in that would trigger the regulation, then there's no need to submit anything to Homeland Security. The question mark is if you're not sure if your inventory has changed, if you don't have a way or haven't been monitoring changes in quantities, new chemicals coming on campus, there's sort of an open-ended risk there of not knowing if you should report. But just to reiterate the question, if you do not have a chemical of interest at a screening threshold quantity, there is no requirement to submit anything to Homeland Security. If you're already regulated, you're already in a tier, you may have ongoing requirements, however. You would know that. You would have already been contacted and been working with them probably for years on your security planning. And if you have a top screen on record from 2007 or after, and you've been contacted by Homeland Security probably recently to update your top screen, then you'd be required to update it and either say we still have it or we don't have it.
Thank you. Next question. If I'm new to the university, how can I find out if my predecessor, they are not available to ask, filed a top screen?
Well, that's a great question, too. So this happened to me. I came in here. I had worked here before, left for a while, came back. Fortunately, there's people here that knew the history. But we learned that when we went into the chemical facility information, the person that had the access was no longer here. So we had to reestablish access to our account. There is a way to do that through the Department of Homeland Security website, through the CFAS website. You can go in to see if you already have anything on record with them. What I would suggest you do is contact their knowledge center and explain what happened. Your submitter, preparer, reviewer, all those people are gone. You don't have any access. You need to reestablish access. If you don't, that would give you a way to know whether you've ever submitted anything before, or if you know you've submitted, you'll get access by just re-registering new names under those categories. If you don't know if somebody ever submitted anything, so much of this is protected information. I'm not sure I have a good answer for that, but I would think that someone at the institution would have been contacted about whether they had any chemicals, and that might give you some clue on to where to go from there. For example, your laboratories would be one example, or if you have any major bulk storage of chemicals, propane, ammonia, things like that, some of them would have been contacted by somebody. Maybe that would give you a head start. But I guess the main thing is you can reestablish connection with your CFAS account if you did have a registration in the past.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes, so we'll keep taking questions. And I've got quite a few questions regarding if the PowerPoint presentation will be available. It will. It'll be in the link that you received of where we've placed the recording, and then a copy of these slides will also be available for people to view. Okay, our next question is, if you submit a top screen showing that you have a COI theft chemical above the STQ, but then you get rid of it within 60 days, can you submit another top screen showing that you no longer have it?
Yes. Yes. That is the most, again, in my opinion, I think that is probably the best strategy, is meet the intent of the law, submit it, say we had it, and then when it's gone, resubmit and say we no longer have it. And that should keep Homeland Security from trying to put you in a risk tier because you no longer have it. And again, I mentioned earlier on, when you don't have something anymore, that's considered good by the Department of Homeland Security. They'd rather have less facilities that have these chemicals of interest.
Okay, our next question is, could you please clarify the placard amount?
Could you repeat that? It broke up a little bit.
Could you please clarify the placard amount?
Placard. Okay, so any placarded amount is referencing Department of Transportation, U.S. Department of Transportation, hazardous materials regulations. So to find out what any placarded amount would be for any specific chemical, you have to go to those regulations and look to see whether there is any amount, that means no matter how small the amount or how big the amount you have to placard, or it means at 1,001 pounds you have to placard. So you really have to check the DOT regulations to know how that affects a particular chemical. And any placarded amount, go back to an earlier slide. A moment. Sorry. Any placarded amount only applies to the sabotage contamination chemicals. So it's a subset of the whole list. And that's what you have to realize. And you look at the chart, and it's a sabotage contamination, and it says a placarded amount. You have to go to DOT to find out what that amount would be that you'd have to placard it at. Now, that isn't, again, you're not placarding it for Homeland Security. You're just having to report it if you have that amount that you would have to placard.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are at the top of the hour. We have a few more questions, and as I said early on, I will send these questions to Maureen with your email address, and she will specifically reach out to answer your questions.
I'd be happy to do that. I just say give me a little time on that. I may not get back to you instantly for more complicated questions. I may even have to do some research, but just give me some time and I'll try to get answers to you as soon as I can.
Okay, and I just want to make everybody on the call aware that the next webinar moderated by the APPA president will be on Thursday, October 26th, noon to 1 Arizona time. And it will be, the topic is responding to catastrophic events on campuses. Again, thank you, Maureen, for your time and great presentation. And thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.